The video begins in a season that is supposed to feel safe. Christmas has a way of softening everything. Airports glow warmer. Strangers smile more easily, and even exhaustion feels temporary because it's wrapped in the promise of rest. For them, this trip was an escape. It was a pause, a breath held gently between one year and the next. They told everyone the same thing. We'll be back before Christmas. Just a few days in Las Vegas. A short holiday before family dinners, gift exchanges, and a familiar weight of home. Nothing dramatic. Nothing risky. Just lights, warmth, and time together. The last morning was ordinary. Alarm clocks. Coffee poured into travel mugs. A suitcase zipped a little too full. One of them joked about overpacking, the way people always do when they're secretly afraid of forgetting something important. There was laughter, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that comes from routine, from knowing someone so well that even silence feels shared. At the airport, Christmas was already everywhere. A plastic tree near the gate. A loop holiday playlist playing too loud through cheap speakers. Children tugging at parents' sleeves, asking how many sleeps were left. Somewhere between security lines and boarding calls, time felt suspended. The world hadn't changed yet. Nothing bad had happened. Nothing could happen. Not here, not now. They sent photos. A blurry selfie with the plane window behind them. A caption that said something simple, something forgettable. Vegas, here we come. No one saved it, because no one thought they needed to. Las Vegas was supposed to be temporary. A place you visit, not a place you stay. A city built on passing through. That was part of its appeal. You arrive, you disappear into noise and color, and then you leave again unchanged, or at least pretending to be. Their hotel room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and recycled air, the kind of room that could belong to anyone. Beige walls, thick curtains, a view of lights that never really go dark. They dropped their bags, kicked off their shoes, and stood for a moment just looking out the window. From that height, everything below looked unreal, like a model city, like nothing could touch you up here. They walked the strip that night, shoulder to shoulder with strangers who would never remember them. Neon reflected in glass. Music overlapping music. 1,000 conversations colliding and dissolving into static. They blended in perfectly. That's the thing about crowds. You can be surrounded and still invisible. Later, there was dinner. A restaurant chosen almost at random. Too much food. Too much noise. They talked about the future the way couples do when they're relaxed. Small plans. Big plans. Half-serious dreams that felt safer when spoken softly. Nothing sounded final. Everything felt open-ended. That night, one of them called home. It wasn't a long call. Just a check-in. Just to say they'd arrived safely. Just to say they were tired but happy. The kind of call that doesn't feel important until it becomes the last one. The voicemail tone was light. Normal. No hesitation. No fear hidden between words. They said they'd talk tomorrow. They always did. The next day passed in fragments that would later be replayed again and again. A receipt timestamp. A security camera angle. A credit card charge that seemed insignificant at the time. Every movement documented by systems designed to record everything except meaning. They were seen together, walking side by side. Calm, unrushed, no signs of an argument, no visible distress. To anyone watching from a distance, they looked like exactly what they were supposed to be. Two people on vacation, carrying nothing heavier than anticipation. As evening approached, the city leaned fully into itself. Lights intensified. Music grew louder. The illusion sharpened. This was the version of Las Vegas people came for. The version that promised distraction from real life, from real consequences. They sent one last message that night. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a routine update. Something like heading out for a bit. Love you. The kind of message that closes a day, not a chapter. No one replied right away. There was no urgency. Why would there be? They were adults. They were together. They were in a place designed to entertain, not end people. Somewhere between that message and the next morning, something shifted. But no one noticed. Not then. Not in the moment. when it might have mattered most. Back home, Christmas preparations continued. Gifts were wrapped. Food was planned. Their names were already placed mentally at the table. Someone bought something small for them, an inside joke gift, expecting to hand it over in just a few days. Morning came in Vegas. Then afternoon. Then night again. Messages went unread. Calls went unanswered. At first, it was brushed off. Time differences. Late nights. Dead batteries. All the reasonable explanations we use to protect ourselves from fear. But Christmas has a way of sharpening absence. When everyone else checks in, silence becomes louder. When phones light up across rooms, one dark screen feels accusatory. By Christmas Eve, concern crept in quietly. Not panic yet, just discomfort. A tightening in the chest that didn't have words attached to it. Family members exchanged glances during conversations. Someone said, "Have you heard from them?" Someone else shook their head and forced a smile. They were supposed to be home by now. The tree was lit. The house smelled like pine and food and familiarity. Outside, snow fell lightly or rain tapped against windows, depending on where you were. Inside, a space remained unfilled, a place held open for people who had promised they would return. Still, no one imagined the truth. Not yet. The mind doesn't go there first. It chooses hope. It chooses delay. It chooses a belief that ordinary stories have ordinary endings. After all, this was just a Christmas trip, just Las Vegas, just a few days away. They had left with suitcases full of clothes and plans and certainty. They had left behind nothing that suggested this would be the moment everything stopped. And somewhere in a glow of holiday lights and unanswered phones, the last normal day quietly became something else, something that would never be put back the way it was. Las Vegas has always understood how to perform. It knows how to draw your eyes upward, toward lights, screens, movement, so you don't notice what's happening at ground level. From the outside, it looks like a promise. From the inside, it's a system, one designed to keep people moving, spending, forgetting. By daylight, the city tells a different story. The neon dims, and what's left feels almost exposed. Sidewalks carry the residue of last night. Discarded flyers, half-remembered footsteps, the sense that something loud just ended and something quieter is beginning. This is a version of Las Vegas most visitors never photograph. The version where the illusion rests. For those passing through, the city offers anonymity as a luxury. You can reinvent yourself here, even briefly. No one asks where you came from or where you're going next. Names don't matter. Schedules blur. Time is measured in check-in and check-out, not mornings and nights. They stepped into this environment without resistance. Like most people do, they weren't looking to disappear. They were looking to be unrecognizable for a moment, to exist outside expectations. A few days where responsibilities stayed behind, waiting patiently at home. Security cameras followed them everywhere, though they never noticed. Hotel lobbies, casino floors, elevators that swallowed people and released them somewhere else. The city sees almost everything, but it doesn't watch closely. Footage is stored, overwritten, archived. Lives reduced to timestamps. On the Strip, the crowds were endless. Tourists weaving between performers and flashing signs. Couples holding hands. Strangers brushing shoulders. Every face briefly visible, then gone. It was the perfect place to blend in, because blending in was the point. They walked slowly, stopping when something caught their attention, moving on when it didn't. No urgency. No sense that time was limited. They weren't racing toward anything. They were letting the city carry them. Inside the casinos, the air was thick and artificial. No windows. No clocks. Sound engineered to keep you alert and disoriented at the same time. Machines rang and chimed with mechanical joy. People sat shoulder to shoulder, each absorbed in their own private hope. Wins and losses happened silently, registered only by blinking numbers. This was a place where thousands of small personal stories unfolded every hour and vanished just as quickly. A city accustomed to turnover, to arrivals without attachment, to departures without explanation. They checked into restaurants the way people do when they're relaxed, without thinking about records, receipts, or memory. They ordered food, talked, laughed softly. Somewhere nearby, a dealer shuffled cards. Somewhere else, a band played a song no one would remember tomorrow. If anyone noticed them, it was briefly. A waiter, a security guard, a passing stranger who registered two silhouettes and then forgot them seconds later. Nothing about them demanded attention. They were ordinary in a city that survives on excess. Las Vegas doesn't feel dangerous when you're inside it. It feels controlled, regulated, watched. There's comfort in the presence of cameras, uniforms, security desks. The illusion is that nothing truly bad can happen in a place so meticulously monitored. But what the city really offers is not safety, it's plausible deniability. Too many people, too many angles, too many versions of the same night overlapping each other. They move through it all as if it were harmless, because for most people it is. Millions come and go without incident. The odds always seem manageable until you're the exception. As night returned, the strip brightened again. Light layered over light, sound swallowing silence. The city felt awake in a way that made sleep feel unnecessary. It encouraged you to stay out longer, to push tomorrow further away. At some point, they left the main stretch. Not abruptly, not secretly, just a turn down a street that didn't glow as brightly. The kind of transition that happens naturally when curiosity outweighs caution. This part of the city didn't advertise itself. Fewer tourists, fewer performers, buildings closer together, lighting less forgiving. It wasn't dangerous. It just wasn't designed to be seen. Here, Las Vegas stopped pretending. Here, it felt like any other city. Concrete, shadow, space where people lived instead of visited. Their footsteps echoed differently. The noise faded, replaced by distance. They weren't alone, but they weren't surrounded either. The anonymity shifted from comforting to uncertain. Security footage would later show them here. Two, still together, still calm, no signs of fear, no one chasing them. No moment that screamed this is where everything went wrong. That's what made it so unsettling. Las Vegas thrives on distraction, but it also thrives on forgetting. Every morning, the city resets itself. Floors cleaned, rooms turned over, new guests welcomed. Whatever happened the night before becomes irrelevant unless it disrupted business. By the time anyone thought to look back, the city had already moved on. For Las Vegas, this was just another holiday week. Occupancy rates high, money flowing, people arriving in waves. Two people blending into the background meant nothing. Not yet, because the city doesn't notice absence. It notices only disruption. And at this point, there was none. They were still officially present, still checked in, still alive in databases and receipts, still part of the noise. Las Vegas had not swallowed them yet, but it had created the perfect conditions for them to be lost without a sound. A city built on vanishing acts doesn't need to hide you. It just needs to keep looking forward. Christmas morning arrived gently, the way it always does. Light filtered through curtains. Phones buzzed with group messages and holiday wishes. Somewhere coffee brewed. Somewhere else, wrapping paper tore open with familiar excitement. It was a morning built on repetition. Traditions performed so often they felt permanent. And yet, something was missing. At first, it didn't announce itself as fear. It came as confusion, a quiet pause between actions. Someone reached for their phone, scrolled through messages, frowned slightly, then put it down again. Maybe they were sleeping in. Maybe the reception was bad. Maybe they'd had a late night and forgotten to charge their phones. Las Vegas, after all, had a reputation. People disappeared for a day or two there all the time. Not in the frightening sense, just in the social one. Late nights turned into late mornings. Time slipped, so the family waited. Hours passed, measured not by clocks, but by glances. Every time a phone lit up, hope rose briefly, only to fall again when it was someone else. Another cousin, another friend, another Merry Christmas from someone whose presence felt suddenly too loud. The tree stood lit in the corner of the room, ornaments catching the light. Gifts were stacked beneath it, including a few with their names written carefully on tags. Someone had used their favorite wrapping paper. Someone had remembered the joke from last year and bought something small and silly, already smiling at the thought of their reaction. But the chairs at the table stayed empty. By mid-morning, concern found its voice. It was tentative at first, disguised as logistics. What time were they supposed to land? Did they say they were coming straight here? Maybe they decided to stay an extra day. Each question carried an answer that sounded reasonable. That was the dangerous part. Reason gave fear somewhere to hide. Another call went to voicemail. Another message remained unread. The tone shifted, slowly. What had felt like patience began to feel like avoidance. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Something's wrong. Christmas has a way of amplifying silence. When everyone else is accounted for, absence becomes undeniable. When laughter fills rooms, the lack of one voice feels deliberate, even when it isn't. Someone checked flight statuses. No cancellations. No delays. The plane had landed exactly when it was supposed to. Someone else pulled up social media. No new posts. No stories. No accidental activity that might suggest they were simply busy. Still no panic. Not yet. Panic felt inappropriate on a holiday. There were children present. There were older relatives who didn't need the stress. There was food that had taken hours to prepare. So the family did what people always do in moments like this. They continued with the day, pretending it was temporary. Gifts were opened. Smiles were forced. Photos were taken with one person carefully positioned to block the empty space where they should have been. Someone suggested waiting until later. They might call tonight, but underneath the surface, a quiet shift had already occurred. The day no longer belonged to celebration. It belonged to waiting. As afternoon turned to evening, excuses lost their strength. Phones don't stay dead forever. People don't ignore Christmas messages without a reason. Adults might disappear socially, but not completely. Not like this. One family member finally said it. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a sentence that fell heavy in the room. I don't like this. That was the moment everything changed. Calls became more frequent. Messages more direct. The tone of the voicemail greetings, once background noise, began to feel mocking in their cheerfulness. Hey, you've reached. Click. Someone suggested calling the hotel. Another hesitated. It felt invasive, like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Calling the hotel meant admitting that this wasn't normal anymore. Eventually, someone did. The front desk confirmed what they could. Yes, they had checked in. Yes, their belongings were still listed as being in the room. No, there hadn't been any official checkout. No, they hadn't asked for an extension. The words were neutral, professional, but they landed with weight. Belongings still in the room. That detail lingered. Suitcases, clothes, personal items. The things people don't leave behind unless they plan to return. The hotel staff said there had been no reported disturbances, no complaints, no incidents. Everything, according to their system, was ordinary. Ordinary began to feel like a lie. By the end of the day, Christmas felt ruined in a way no one wanted to acknowledge. Not because gifts were unopened or meals uneaten, but because the future had suddenly gone quiet. Someone mentioned the police. The word hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Another person shook their head. They're adults, they said. They probably just need time. There was fear behind the hesitation. Calling the police meant making it official. It meant writing down names, dates, last known locations. It meant stepping into a process that didn't guarantee answers. And there was another fear, too, one no one said out loud. What if this was intentional? What if they chose not to come back? The idea hurt more than any other possibility. It reframed everything. Every goodbye, every conversation, every small argument or unresolved tension suddenly felt suspicious. But deep down, the family knew. This wasn't disappearance by choice. It didn't feel like them. It didn't fit the people they knew. Night fell. Christmas lights glowed outside homes across the neighborhood. Somewhere, fireworks cracked softly. Inside, the family sat in a living room that felt too large. Phones lay face up on tables, screens dark. Sleep came in fragments, if at all. Every vibration, real or imagined, pulled someone awake. Every dream ended abruptly, unfinished. In Las Vegas, the city continued as it always did. New guests checked in. Rooms were cleaned. Floors were vacuumed. The absence of two people went unnoticed by everyone except those who loved them. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Christmas was over. The world had moved on. But for the family, time had stopped. This wasn't just a missed call anymore. It wasn't just a delayed flight or a holiday oversight. It was the beginning of a question that would stretch far beyond Christmas. Where do you go when you vanish in a city designed not to remember you? The first official conversation felt strangely anticlimactic. There was no urgency in the voice on the other end of the line, no sharp intake of breath, no sudden shift in tone that suggested the gravity the family felt. Just calm questions, names spelled carefully, dates confirmed, ages noted. The people taking the report had heard this story before. Adults gone missing after a trip to Las Vegas. Most of the time, it ended the same way. A delayed return. A misunderstanding. Someone deciding not to come back when everyone expected them to. The phrase came gently, almost kindly. They're adults. They have the right to disappear. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to explain. But it landed like a dismissal. The family tried to describe what felt wrong. The unanswered calls. The untouched luggage. The Christmas silence. But feelings don't translate well into paperwork. Fear has no checkbox. Intuition doesn't fit into a report. The response remained measured. There was no evidence of foul play, no abandoned car, no signs of distress, no frantic message asking for help. Just two adults last seen enjoying a holiday. From the outside, it looked like a choice. That assumption became the foundation of the official story, not spoken outright, but implied in every response. Voluntary absence, extended vacation, personal reasons. It was easier that way, easier to categorize, easier to postpone. Security footage was requested, reviewed, summarized. The family was told what the cameras showed. The couple walking through a casino, entering an elevator, exiting into a brightly lit corridor. Their posture relaxed, their pace unhurried. They looked fine. That phrase came up more than once. They look fine, as if danger always announces itself, as if fear is always visible. There was no footage of them arguing, no footage of them being followed, no footage of them running or signaling for help. Just movement, just normalcy. The city, through its cameras, offered nothing dramatic enough to demand attention. Hotel records confirmed what the family already knew. The room hadn't been officially vacated. No checkout request. No housekeeping refusal. Just two names still attached to a reservation that had quietly expired. Their belongings remained untouched. Clothes folded. Toiletries lined up neatly. Chargers plugged into outlets. A suitcase half open, as if someone had planned to finish packing later. Later never came. Still, the official tone remained restrained. A missing persons report was filed, but it carried no urgency tag. No alerts. No public call for information, just a document entered into a system filled with thousands of others. Time passed differently now. Each day that went by without answers made the story feel less current, less actionable. Cases like this depended on momentum, and momentum was already slipping away. The family felt it in the way conversations changed, in how often they had to repeat themselves, in how carefully they were listened to, without anything actually happening. They were advised to wait. Wait for bank activity. Wait for phone pings. Wait for someone to surface. Waiting became the official strategy. When credit card statements were reviewed, they offered no clarity. A few charges from the first days. Meals. Entertainment. Nothing after that. No trail leading forward. No indication of travel. Just an abrupt stop. Phones were traced as far as they could be. The last signal placed them in the same general area of the city where they had last been seen on camera. After that, nothing. No movement. No data. The silence was interpreted as intentional. If they wanted to be found, they would reach out. That sentence echoed long after it was said. The family began to feel as though they were arguing against an invisible narrative, one that painted their loved ones as distant, unreliable, maybe even selfish. People who chose freedom over obligation. That version hurt more than the uncertainty. It reframed the disappearance as a decision rather than a loss. Friends tried to help in the only way they knew how. They offered theories. Maybe they had a fight. Maybe one of them needed space. Maybe they met someone. Maybe they wanted a fresh start. Each suggestion meant a comfort, felt like an accusation. The family knew their routines, their plans, the life waiting for them back home, jobs, commitments, people they wouldn't abandon without a word. But belief didn't count as evidence. As days turned into weeks, the case slipped further into background. New reports came in. New emergencies demanded attention. 2 missing adults without signs of violence didn't rise to the top. The family began doing the work themselves, calling hospitals, checking shelters, reaching out to advocacy groups, posting flyers that felt almost informative in a city of millions. Faces stared back from photocopied pages. Pinned to boards few people noticed. Names became questions strangers didn't have answers for. Every conversation with authorities ended the same way. Polite, non-committal, encouraging patience. The city had no reason to believe something terrible had happened. And without that belief, there was no urgency to look deeper. But the family felt the truth pressing in, not as certainty, but as weight, a heaviness that settled into their days, their sleep, their conversations. This wasn't just absence. It was erasure. Somewhere, the story of what happened to them was being overwritten by time, by assumptions, by a system designed to respond to proof, not possibility. And the longer the official story remained incomplete, the more permanent it began to feel. Not missing, just gone. As the official narrative stalled, the story began to fracture into versions. Not facts, interpretations. Each one shaped by memory, by guilt, by the desperate human need to explain what no longer made sense. To understand where they might have gone, people started asking who they really were. The answers were never simple. They were remembered differently depending on who you asked. To some, they were steady, reliable, the kind of people who showed up when they said they would. To others, they were restless, always talking about change, about wanting something more, something different. Neither version was wrong. Both existed at the same time. That duality became fertile ground for speculation. Friends replayed conversation from months earlier, searching for clues that hadn't mattered then. A comment about being tired, a joke about starting over, a passing frustration about money or work. Words that once felt harmless now carried weight they were never meant to hold. Family members argued quietly among themselves, not out of anger, but confusion. Someone insisted they would never leave voluntarily. Someone else wondered aloud if maybe one of them had wanted to disappear, and the other had followed out of love or obligation. The idea was painful. It suggested imbalance. It suggested sacrifice. It also suggested motive. Their relationship, one seen as private and ordinary, became a subject of analysis. People dissected it the way investigators dissect crime scenes, looking for cracks, stress points, moments where everything could have shifted. They had argued before. All couples do, sometimes about money, sometimes about the future, sometimes about nothing at all. But there was no history of violence, no restraining orders, no public breakdowns. From the outside, they appeared stable. From the inside, like all relationships, there were things no one else saw. One of them had been feeling pressure at work. Long hours, little recognition. The kind of slow exhaustion that doesn't announce itself but settles into the bones. The other had been worried about family, aging relatives, responsibilities that felt heavier each year. They talked about moving someday, not running away, just relocating, a different city, a quieter life. It was a dream shared by millions of people who never act on it. But now, that dream was being recast as intent. Financial records were scrutinized next, not because there was evidence of trouble, but because money always becomes suspect in disappearances. Debts, withdrawals, hidden accounts. The records told a frustrating story. Ordinary. Bills paid on time. No sudden cash withdrawals. No empty accounts. No preparation for vanishing. If this had been planned, it was planned badly. Yet doubt persisted. People have a hard time accepting randomness. It's easier to believe in secrets than accidents. Easier to assign intention than to sit with not knowing. As the weeks stretched on, the family began to feel watched, not by cameras, but by opinions. Every time the case was mentioned, someone had a theory, some sympathetic, some intrusive, some quietly judgmental. The couple's lives were reduced to bullet points: age, occupation, relationship status, last known movements. Complexity flattened into summary. What got lost was who they were when no one was looking. The way one of them hummed absent-mindedly while cooking. The way the other folded laundry meticulously, as if order could be summoned into existence. The private rituals that made their life feel real and grounded. Those details didn't make it into reports. But they mattered because they contradicted the idea that this disappearance was casual or careless. As speculation grew, so did guilt. Family members wondered if they had missed something. A sign, a plea disguised as a joke, a moment when one of them seemed distant and no one pressed further. Hindsight is merciless. It takes ordinary moments and sharpens them into accusations. There was also the question no one wanted to ask directly. If something bad had happened, why hadn't anyone noticed? Las Vegas is full of witnesses. Cameras, security, staff trained to watch for trouble. The idea that two people could simply vanish without triggering any alarms felt impossible. And yet, here they were. The longer the mystery endured, the more their identities became malleable. They were no longer fixed individuals. They were characters in an unfinished story, shaped by whoever was telling it. To some, they became symbols of escape. To others, cautionary tales. To their family, they remained painfully human, frozen in the last version of themselves that existed before everything stopped. This tension between who they were and who people imagined them to be became its own kind of loss. Every new theory felt like a small theft, pulling them further away from the truth. In trying to understand the disappearance, people were slowly erasing the people themselves. And somewhere beneath all the versions, the real story waited, unchanged, untouched by speculation, sealed inside the silence left behind. Time did not move forward so much as it settled. It pressed down on everything, slowly, evenly, until the disappearance became part of the landscape of daily life. Not resolved, not forgotten, just there. At first, the family measured time in days, then weeks. Eventually, years began to pass, marked not by answers but by endurance. Birthdays arrived with an extra layer of silence. Holidays came and went, each one reopening the same wound in a slightly different way. The waiting changed them. In the early months, hope was loud. Every unknown number felt promising. Every news notification carried potential. There was still energy in the search. Calls made, emails sent, follow-ups demanded. The belief that persistence would be rewarded. But hope, when stretched too thin, begins a fray. As time went on, the calls slowed. Not because the family cared less, but because there was less to say. Every conversation with authorities followed the same pattern. No new leads, no updates, no movement. The case hadn't closed. It had simply stopped breathing. The family learned the language of ambiguity. They learned how to answer questions without really answering them. Any news became not yet, a phrase that held everything and nothing at the same time. They learned how to exist in a state without permission to grieve. Funerals provide an ending. Graves offer a place to stand. This offered neither. Psychologists have a name for it: ambiguous loss. A condition where the person is gone, but not gone enough to mourn, where hope and despair coexist, canceling each other out. It hollowed them. Some days, the absence felt distant, almost manageable. Other days, it arrived unexpectedly, in the middle of the grocery store aisle, in the sound of laughter that matched one of theirs, in the sight of a coat they would have loved. There was no pattern. Grief followed no schedule. Life around them continued, unbothered. Friends moved forward. Children grew. Careers shifted. The world did not pause to acknowledge what had been lost. That more than anything, felt cruel. Over time, the family developed rituals of uncertainty, checking emails they knew would be empty, revisiting timelines they knew by heart, scanning crowds instinctively, as if recognition might still be possible. They kept phones charged at night just in case. Not because they believed a call would come, but because not being ready felt like betrayal. The couple's belongings were boxed up carefully, not thrown away, not distributed, preserved, each item treated as if it might still be needed, clothes folded the way they liked them, shoes cleaned before being stored. Letting go felt dangerous, like tempting fate. Years passed like this. Then, gradually, something shifted, not acceptance, something quieter. The family began to recognize the cost of waiting forever, the way it drained energy, the way it reshaped identity. They were no longer just parents, siblings, relatives. They were people with a missing person. That label followed them everywhere. Some chose to step back from the search, not because they stopped caring, but because survival required boundaries. Others couldn't. They remained tethered to question, unwilling to loosen their grip even slightly. This created distance, quiet tension. Grief does not unify people the way movies suggest. It isolates. It demands different things from different people. The city of Las Vegas receded into abstraction, no longer a real place, but a symbol, a word that tightened the chest when spoken, a place the family avoided thinking about, because thinking about it led nowhere. Meanwhile, the physical world changed. Buildings were renovated, businesses closed, streets were repaved, places where the couple had walked were altered, erased, rebuilt. The city did not preserve the moment of their disappearance. It layered new moments on top of it. Evidence, if it existed, aged quietly. The case files gathered dust. Digital records were archived. Footage was overwritten. The trail grew colder, not because it had been thoroughly explored, but because time made it inconvenient. This is how disappearances fade, not with answers, but with administrative silence. The family lived in two timelines at once. The present, where life demanded attention, and the past, frozen on the last day they were known to be alive. Sometimes the two collided. A song from that trip would play unexpectedly. A photo would surface during a phone upgrade. A memory would resurface without warning. Those moments hurt more than anniversaries. They were reminders that the story had no ending. People stopped asking questions, not out of indifference, but discomfort. Missing persons make others uneasy. They force confrontation with uncertainty, with the idea that the world does not always resolve itself neatly. So the silence spread. The family learned to carry it. Quietly, invisibly, the way you carry something heavy for so long it becomes part of your posture. They did not know it yet, but the story had not ended. It had only gone underground, waiting, preserved in concrete and time, for a moment when the city would be forced to remember. Because not all truths surface when they should. Some wait until the ground itself is torn open. Years after the disappearance, the building stood in a part of the city most people never visited unless they had a reason. It wasn't on the Strip. It didn't glow at night. It didn't appear in vacation photos or travel guides. It existed quietly, doing its job until it no longer could. Time had not been kind to it. The exterior showed signs of neglect. Faded paint, boarded windows, a parking lot cracked by heat and disuse. Weeds pushed through concrete where cars once lined up. The kind of place that blended into background of the city, unnoticed by everyone except those who passed it every day. At one point, it had mattered. It had been useful. People had worked there, laughed there, complained there. Then newer buildings arrived. Flashier buildings. Buildings better suited to a city obsessed with reinvention. And so this one was left behind. Ownership changed hands quietly. Paperwork filed without ceremony. A development plan replaced whatever purpose it once served. Progress, in the way cities define it, required removal. The demolition was scheduled months in advance. Permits approved. Crews assigned. Timelines established. It was routine work. Another structure, making way for something more profitable. No one connected this building to the disappearance. Not the family. Not investigators. Not the city. Why would they? It wasn't a crime scene. It wasn't even a point of interest. Just a forgotten structure in a city full of forgotten structures. The workers arrived early in the morning, as they always did. Hard hats, coffee cups, the quiet rhythm of people preparing for physical labor. There was nothing unusual about the job briefing. No warnings, no special instructions, just another teardown. Inside, the air smelled stale. Old dust, mold, the faint echo of something that once felt alive. Lights flickered where they still worked at all. Shadows clung to corners, undisturbed for years. The building had been empty for a long time. Or at least, that's what the record said. Demolition is a process, not a single moment. Walls are opened. Ceilings are exposed. Layers peel back one by one. The past is revealed in fragments. Old signage, outdated wiring, forgotten personal items left behind by people who assumed they'd return someday. A coffee mug in a drawer. A jacket on a hook. Traces of ordinary life suspended mid-sentence. As the crew moved deeper into the structure, the work slowed. Not because of difficulty, but caution. Old buildings hide surprises. Asbestos, structural instability, spaces that don't match blueprints. One section in particular raised questions. A part of the building that didn't align with the original plans. A sealed area that shouldn't have been sealed. Construction over construction, done hastily at some point in the past. The foreman made a note. Adjustments were made. Equipment repositioned. This wasn't uncommon. Buildings evolve. Renovations pile up. History leaves uneven layers. Then something stopped the work. It wasn't dramatic. No alarms. No shouting. Just a pause. The kind that spreads when one person notices something they weren't supposed to. The machinery powered down. Dust settled. Silence filled the space. There was a moment of confusion. A quiet exchange. A second look. Whatever it was, it didn't belong there. Work sites are full of strange finds. Old tools, debris, animal remains. But this was different. This demanded distance. Respect. Stillness. The crew stepped back. Protocols took over. Phones came out, but not to record. To call. To report. To transfer responsibility. The building, forgotten for so long, had just interrupted its own erasure. News of the discovery moved slowly at first, contained within procedures and professional restraint. But even before names were attached, even before confirmation, something had shifted. The past had resurfaced. The structure that had stood quietly, ignored by a city that never looks back, had been keeping something intact, protected by neglect, hidden by layers of concrete and assumption. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, answers had been sought in databases, footage, interviews. And all along, the truth had remained stationary, buried not by intention, but by indifference. The demolition site was secured. Work halted. The building's final act was to refuse to disappear quietly. And somewhere else, miles away, a phone rang. For the first time in years, it wasn't unanswered. The call did not come with details. It didn't need to. The tone alone was enough to signal that something fundamental had changed. After years of silence, of vague updates and empty reassurances, this was different. This was not a check-in. It was not a formality. It was a disruption. The demolition site was sealed off within hours. Yellow tape cut across a space that had never mattered to anyone outside a small radius. Vehicles were rerouted. Workers were sent home early, their day ending in confusion rather than exhaustion. Inside the secure perimeter, time slowed. Investigators moved carefully, not because of drama, but because of weight. Every step carried the understanding that whatever had been found had waited a long time to be seen. Dust clung to surfaces undisturbed for years. Concrete edges told a story of construction done in layers, not all of them planned. The space itself felt wrong, not dangerous, but deliberate, a place shaped by decisions rather than decay. What had stopped the machines was not immediately identifiable as anything specific. It wasn't arranged. It wasn't staged. It was simply out of place in a way that defied explanation. Human presence leaves patterns. Even after years, those patterns persist. Personal effects were the first confirmation. Items that do not migrate on their own. Items that do not belong in abandoned spaces. Things that once lived in pockets, bags, hands. A shoe, worn in a way that suggested movement. Fabric that still held shape. Objects that had been carried, not discarded. The discovery unfolded slowly, layer by layer. There was no rush, no spectacle, just the steady realization that this was not an accident of demolition. It was an interruption of history. Forensic teams replaced construction crews. Clipboards replaced blueprints. Cameras documented instead of erased. The building, once marked for destruction, was now a site of preservation. Outside, speculation began almost immediately. News travels differently now. It doesn't wait for confirmation. It fills gaps with possibility. A discovery during demolition becomes something larger before anyone has time to prepare for it. But inside the perimeter, everything remained controlled. Names were not spoken yet. Connections were not announced. The process demanded patience. Still, there was no denying the shape of the truth beginning to emerge. This was not recent. Time had settled here. Years had passed without disturbance. Whatever had happened, it had happened long ago, close enough to the disappearance that the timeline felt suddenly compressed, as if all those years of waiting were collapsing inward. When identification procedures began, the weight shifted again. Scientific steps, methodical comparisons, DNA collection, the quiet language of confirmation. There's a moment in every long-running missing persons case when hope and dread collide, when the possibility of answers becomes inseparable from the certainty of loss. This was that moment. The family was informed with care. No details offered beyond what was necessary, just enough to prepare them for what was coming, enough to say that the waiting, at least part of it, was over. For some, the news arrived as relief before it arrived as grief. The end of uncertainty can feel merciful, even when the truth it delivers is unbearable. Others felt something closer to disbelief. After so many years, the idea that the story could suddenly resume felt impossible, like reopening a book long believed unfinished. The building, now reduced to a forensic space, became a focal point for questions no one had thought to ask before. Why here? How here? How had this gone unnoticed? Investigators began reconstructing what the city had overlooked. Old permits, renovation records, ownership changes, layers of bureaucracy that had quietly sealed a moment in time behind concrete. Each discovery rewrote assumptions. This was not a place people wandered into by accident. It wasn't visible from the street. It wasn't part of public access. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Someone had known this space existed. Someone had understood how easily it could be forgotten. As the evidence accumulated, the story shifted from mystery to reckoning, not just about what happened to two people, but about how systems fail, how spaces are erased, how absence can be physically hidden in plain sight. The city, for once, was forced to pause. Construction stopped. Progress delayed. Attention redirected backward. For years, the disappearance had been a question without a location. Now it had coordinates, walls, measurements. It had a place. And with that place came the undeniable truth that this was never about wandering too far or choosing not to come home. This was about being swallowed by something built to be ignored. The machines had uncovered more than remains. They had uncovered a silence that should never have lasted this long. Section 8, the call, did not come with details. It didn't need to. The tone alone was enough to signal that something fundamental had changed. After years of silence, of vague updates and empty reassurances, this was different. This was not a check-in. It was not a formality. It was a disruption. The demolition site was sealed off within hours. Yellow tape cut across a space that had never mattered to anyone outside a small radius. Vehicles were rerouted. Workers were sent home early, their day ending in confusion rather than exhaustion. Inside the secure perimeter, time slowed. Investigators moved carefully, not because of drama, but because of weight. Every step carried the understanding that whatever had been found had waited a long time to be seen. Dust clung to surfaces undisturbed for years. Concrete edges told a story of construction done in layers, not all of them planned. The space itself felt wrong, not dangerous, but deliberate, a place shaped by decisions rather than decay. What had stopped the machines was not immediately identifiable as anything specific. It wasn't arranged. It wasn't staged. It was simply out of place in a way that defied explanation. Human presence leaves patterns. Even after years, those patterns persist. Personal effects were the first confirmation. Items that do not migrate on their own. Items that do not belong in abandoned spaces. Things that once lived in pockets, bags, hands. A shoe, worn in a way that suggested movement. Fabric that still held shape. Objects that had been carried, not discarded. The discovery unfolded slowly, layer by layer. There was no rush, no spectacle, just the steady realization that this was not an accident of demolition. It was an interruption of history. Forensic teams replaced construction crews. Clipboards replaced blueprints. Cameras documented instead of erased. The building, once marked for destruction, was now a site of preservation. Outside, speculation began almost immediately. News travels differently now. It doesn't wait for confirmation. It fills gaps with possibility. A discovery during demolition becomes something larger before anyone has time to prepare for it. But inside the perimeter, everything remained controlled. Names were not spoken yet. Connections were not announced. The process demanded patience. Still, there was no denying the shape of the truth beginning to emerge. This was not recent. Time had settled here. Years had passed without disturbance. Whatever had happened, it had happened long ago, close enough to the disappearance that the timeline felt suddenly compressed, as if all those years of waiting were collapsing inward. When identification procedures began, the weight shifted again. Scientific steps, methodical comparisons, DNA collection, the quiet language of confirmation. There's a moment in every long-running missing persons case when hope and dread collide, when the possibility of answers becomes inseparable from the certainty of loss. This was that moment. The family was informed with care. No details offered beyond what was necessary, just enough to prepare them for what was coming, enough to say that the waiting, at least part of it, was over. For some, the news arrived as relief before it arrived as grief. The end of uncertainty can feel merciful, even when the truth it delivers is unbearable. Others felt something closer to disbelief. After so many years, the idea that the story could suddenly resume felt impossible, like reopening a book long believed unfinished. The building, now reduced to a forensic space, became a focal point for questions no one had thought to ask before. Why here? How here? How had this gone unnoticed? Investigators began reconstructing what the city had overlooked. Old permits, renovation records, ownership changes, layers of bureaucracy that had quietly sealed a moment in time behind concrete. Each discovery rewrote assumptions. This was not a place people wandered into by accident. It wasn't visible from the street. It wasn't part of public access. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Someone had known this space existed. Someone had understood how easily it could be forgotten. As the evidence accumulated, the story shifted from mystery to reckoning. Not just about what happened to people, but about how systems fail, how spaces are erased, how absence can be physically hidden in plain sight. The city, for once, was forced to pause. Construction stopped. Progress delayed. Attention redirected backward. For years, the disappearance had been a question without a location. Now it had coordinates, walls, measurements. It had a place. And with that place came the undeniable truth that this was never about wandering too far or choosing not to come home. This was about being swallowed by something built to be ignored. The machines had uncovered more than remains. They had uncovered a silence that should never have lasted this long. Once the discovery became undeniable, the past was no longer something to speculate about. It was something to interrogate. Every assumption that had once felt reasonable now looked fragile. Every explanation that had slowed the search suddenly felt insufficient. The story had to be told again, from the beginning, but this time with the knowledge that the ending had been waiting all along. Investigators returned to timelines that had been reviewed countless times before. Only now, the timestamps felt different, heavier. Moments that once seemed inconsequential were given new attention. A camera angle dismissed as routine. A gap in footage once attributed to technical failure. A location that had never been flagged because it didn't seem relevant. Relevance, it turned out, had always been a matter of perspective. The last confirmed sightings were re-examined frame by frame. The way they walked, the way they stood close without touching, the absence of urgency in their movements. It no longer suggested safety. It suggested unawareness. They did not know what was coming, and neither did anyone watching. The area near the building was mapped in detail. Street access, sightlines, lighting conditions at different hours, how close it was to places they had already been that night, how easy it would have been to pass nearby without noticing anything unusual. It became painfully clear how thin the line had been between visibility and invisibility. The building itself told its own story. Renovation records showed periods of construction that overlapped with the time of the disappearance. Walls added, spaces sealed, modifications made without detailed inspection, changes approved because nothing seemed wrong. No one had been looking for something hidden, so no one had found it. Ownership changes complicated accountability. Each new owner inherited not just the property, but its silence. Renovations were completed without a full understanding of what existed beneath surfaces. Inspections focused on safety and compliance, not history. The truth had been entombed by process. As evidence accumulated, the case shifted from missing persons to something far more unsettling. The question was no longer where they had gone, but how they had been kept from being found. That distinction mattered. It reframed the years of waiting. It challenged the idea that time alone had erased the trail. Instead, it suggested that the trail had been deliberately, or at least effectively, buried. The family struggled to absorb this transformation. For years, they had lived with the possibility, however painful, that the disappearance might have been a choice. That narrative, once imposed externally, had slowly seeped inward despite their resistance. Now it collapsed. With confirmation came anger. Not explosive, not immediate, but steady and sharp. Anger at assumptions, at delays, at how easily two lives had been written off as voluntary absence. They replayed early conversations in their minds, hearing them differently now. The calm voices, the reassurances to wait, the emphasis on adulthood and autonomy. Autonomy, they realized, had been mistaken for indifference. The grief that followed was not clean. It did not arrive as a single wave. It arrived layered, relief tangled with devastation, clarity tangled with regret. Knowing what happened did not undo the years spent not knowing. If anything, it intensified them. They learned details slowly, carefully, not all at once. The family was spared unnecessary specifics, but the implications were unavoidable. The place where their loved ones had been found was not random. It was not exposed. It was not a place anyone stumbled into. This raised questions no one wanted to answer out loud. Who else had been there? Who had access? Who knew and did not speak? Investigators followed those questions as far as evidence allowed. But time had eroded much of what might have offered clarity. Witnesses had moved on. Records were incomplete. Memory itself had become unreliable. Not every truth survives long enough to be proven. The city responded in its own way, carefully, cautiously. Statements were released, procedures reviewed, language chosen to acknowledge tragedy, without assigning blame. Progress demanded restraint, but for the family, restraint fell hollow. They did not want platitudes about lessons learned. They wanted to know how this had been possible, how two people could vanish so completely that their absence became theoretical rather than urgent. They wanted to know why the building had never been considered, why its existence had been treated as irrelevant, why no one had thought to look beneath the surface. There were no satisfying answers. What emerged instead was a portrait of systemic failure, not dramatic, not malicious, but deeply human. Assumptions stacked on assumptions, decisions deferred, responsibility diluted across departments, timelines, and roles. No single moment of neglect, just many small ones. As the story reached the public, Reactions followed familiar patterns: shock, sympathy, outrage, questions that echoed those the family had been asking for years. How could this happen? How could no one notice? How could answers be so close and yet so unreachable? For a brief moment, the city paused to reflect. The disappearance was no longer abstract. It had weight. It had location. It had proof. But attention, like memory, is fragile. As weeks passed, coverage softened. The demolition resumed under new oversight. The site, once again, moved toward erasure, this time documented, acknowledged, but still moving forward. The family watched this with a mixture of resignation and disbelief. Even now, the world seemed eager to build over what had been uncovered. Progress does not linger. Privately, the family worked to reclaim the narrative. They spoke not just about what happened, but about who their loved ones had been before the disappearance consumed them. They told stories that did not begin or end with Vegas. Stories rooted in ordinary moments, in warmth, in life. They refused to let the final chapter define the entire book. Yet even as they did, they felt the permanence of what had been lost. Not just 2 lives, but the years spent searching, waiting, imagining different outcomes. Those years could not be returned. The truth had come, but late, and lateness carries its own kind of cruelty. In the end, the story did not offer the clarity people expect from resolution. There was no single revelation that made everything make sense. No justice that felt proportional to the loss. What remained was something quieter and harder to name. The knowledge that answers can exist without salvation. That discovery does not undo disappearance. That sometimes the truth arrives not as relief, but as confirmation of how much was allowed to slip away. And as the city resumed its rhythm, the family carried forward with new burden. Not wondering where their loved ones were anymore, but wondering how the world had failed to notice them when it mattered most. Even after the discovery, even after the timelines were rewritten and the questions reframed, the story refused to settle into anything resembling peace. Closure, it turned out, was not something that arrived automatically with answers. It was not a switch flipped by confirmation. It was not granted simply because the waiting had ended. Instead, a different kind of unrest took its place. The family learned quickly that knowing what happened did not explain why it had been allowed to happen this way. The deeper truth was not just personal. It was structural. It lived in systems, habits, assumptions that extended far beyond one disappearance, one building, one city. The question that lingered was not dramatic. It did not scream. It whispered, persistently, into every quiet moment. How could this have gone unseen? They returned again and again to the same realization. Nothing about the disappearance was invisible on its own. Each piece existed. The last sightings, the incomplete timelines, the unexplored spaces. What was missing was connection, curiosity, the willingness to look where no one expected answers to be. The building had never been secret. It had been overlooked. That distinction mattered. Las Vegas, like many cities built on speed and spectacle, was designed to move forward without reflection. Its economy depended on reinvention. Old things were meant to disappear, physically, culturally, emotionally. New structures replaced old ones. New stories replaced old headlines. Memory was bad for business. In that context, the disappearance became less an anomaly and more of a symptom, a demonstration of how easily people could fall through cracks when attention was directed elsewhere, when absence was interpreted as choice, when silence was treated as consent. The family began to understand that what happened to their loved ones was not only about circumstance, it was about probability. In a city of millions, individuals become data points. Outliers are smoothed over. Patterns are favored over exceptions. They had been the exception, and exceptions rarely inspire urgency. The official responses reflected this uncomfortable truth. Reviews were conducted. Procedures were discussed. Language like oversight and missed opportunity appeared in statements. No one denied that mistakes had been made, but no one claimed ownership of them either. Responsibility, like the disappearance itself, diffused. For the family, this was almost harder than the years of not knowing. At least uncertainty had been honest. This felt sanitized, managed, processed until it lost its emotional weight. They were told that changes would be made, that lessons had been learned, that future cases would benefit from what had been uncovered here. But future cases were abstractions, hypotheticals. Their loss was not. They found themselves caught between gratitude and resentment, grateful that the truth had emerged at all, resentful that it had taken destruction, literal destruction, for it to surface. A building had to be torn apart for someone to finally look closely enough. What did that say about the value placed on what lay beneath? The city slowly returned to its routines. Traffic resumed. Construction schedules adjusted. Another structure would rise where the old one fell. It would be newer, cleaner, brighter. It would serve its purpose. And almost no one would know what once existed there. The family visited the site once quietly, not as part of any official process, just to stand near the place that had held their answers for so long. There was nothing to see, no markers, no indication that this patch of ground carried significance. That absence felt intentional. They realized in that memory, like justice, requires effort. Without it, even the most devastating truths can be absorbed and forgotten. In private moments, they wrestled with the finality of it all, not just the loss, but the understanding that some questions would never be answered. Intent, sequence, accountability. Those gaps would remain. And yet, life continued to demand participation. Bills had to be paid, jobs maintained, relationships nurtured. The world did not adjust its expectations to accommodate unresolved grief, so they learned to carry it differently. They spoke about their loved ones more freely now, not with the tension of uncertainty, but with the steadiness of remembrance. They shared stories that had nothing to do with disappearance, stories that reasserted presence. They refused to let the narrative end at discovery. Still, the question lingered, not just for them, but for anyone willing to sit with the story long enough. What happens to the people who vanish without spectacle? Not the ones whose cases dominate headlines, not the ones whose stories fit neat arcs, but the ones who disappear quietly, without disruption, into spaces no one thinks to examine. The answer was unsettling. They are absorbed by cities that prioritize movement over memory, by systems that respond to certainty, not concern, by assumptions that feel reasonable until they aren't. The family understood now that disappearance is rarely a single moment. It is a process, one that begins with small decisions, waiting instead of acting, assuming instead of asking, categorizing instead of questioning. Each step seems harmless on its own. Together, they become permanent. In the end, what haunted them most was not the discovery itself, but the proximity of the truth all along. How close answers had been. How easily they could have been found if someone had just looked in a different direction. The city would never feel that weight. It could not afford to. But the story lingered, quietly resisting erasure, in conversations, in reflections, in the unease it planted in those who encountered it and realized how thin the line really was between being seen and being forgotten. The disappearance no longer asked where they. It asked something far more uncomfortable. Who is responsible for noticing when someone doesn't come back? And what does it say about us when the answer is no one? That question remained unanswered, unresolved. Long after the dust settled, the site cleared and the city resumed its glow. It followed the family forward, not as a mystery, but as a warning, because in places designed to forget, remembering becomes an act of resistance. And some stories demand to be remembered, not because they are extraordinary, but because they reveal how easily ordinary lives can disappear when the world decides not to look back. It arrives whether anyone is ready or not, whether the house feels full or hollow, whether the past feels close or impossibly far away. It comes with the same calendar certainty it always has, indifferent to what has changed in the spaces between years. For the family, the first Christmas after the discovery was quieter than any before it, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. The tree went up later than usual. Decorations were fewer. Some were left in boxes, not out of avoidance, but because certain traditions no longer knew where they belonged. Ornaments that once felt joyful now carried weight, each one a reminder of how many holidays had passed in suspension. This time, there was no waiting. No phones left face up in hope. No excuses rehearsed in advance. No belief that a call might still come. That absence, clear, defined, undeniable, was different from the one they had lived with for years. It was sharper, but also quieter. It no longer asked questions. It made statements. They spoke their names out loud that day, intentionally, without fear of jinxing hope or tempting disappointment. Saying the names felt grounding, like placing something fragile back into human language after it had been trapped in uncertainty for too long. They talked about small things. How one of them always woke up earlier than necessary on holidays, unable to sleep through anticipation. How the other wrapped gifts with meticulous care, folding corners precisely, taping edges until nothing showed. How they laughed at the same moments in old movies, every time, as if humor were a shared instinct rather than a reaction. These details mattered more now than ever. They reclaimed the narrative from timelines and reports, from buildings and discoveries, from the finality that threatened to reduce entire lives to a single location. Memory became an act of resistance. Outside, the world looked the same. Lights strung across houses, music drifting from open car windows, stores crowded with people fulfilling rituals they didn't question. The city where everything had happened, Las Vegas, continued on its own path. New developments opened. Old structures vanished. The site where the building once stood no longer drew attention. It was clean, efficient, productive. Nothing there suggested what had been found. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. How easily a place could shed its history. How quickly the physical world could move past what the human one could not. The family understood now that cities do not grieve. They do not remember unless forced to. They are designed to absorb and overwrite, to prioritize what comes next over what came before. But people are different. People carry absence forward. They learn how to live alongside it, not by resolving it, but by integrating it, quietly, imperfectly, every day. In the month that followed, the story faded from public attention, as stories always do. New headlines replaced old ones. Other tragedies claimed space in the collective consciousness. What remained was not outrage or spectacle, but something more subtle, unease. For those who had followed the story closely, it left behind a discomfort that didn't quite resolve, a lingering awareness of how close the truth had been, how fragile the boundary was between being seen and being overlooked. For the family, life reorganized itself around a new reality, not the old one defined by waiting, and not a healed one defined by peace, but something in between. They visited familiar places differently now, walked through rooms with an awareness of how silence accumulates. They noticed how often people assume that not knowing is the same as not caring. They knew better. They had lived inside the space between. Sometimes, late at night, one of them would think about the building, not with fear, but with a strange sense of intimacy, as if it had been a reluctant witness. Never meant to hold what it did, never meant to keep a secret for so long. They wondered how many other spaces like that existed, not just in Las Vegas, but everywhere. Places passed every day without a second glance. Walls built over moments that never found resolution. The thought was unsettling, but also clarifying. Disappearances, they realized, don't always happen because someone is taken far away. Sometimes they happen because no one looks closely enough at what's right in front of them. The family chose not to mark the site publicly. No plaque, no announcement. They understood that memorials require permanence, and the world they lived in was not built for that. Instead, they marked time differently. They remembered anniversaries privately, lit candles without ceremony, told stories without editing them down to lessons or warnings. They allowed themselves moments of joy without guilt, something that felt impossible during the years of uncertainty. Joy no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like survival. And yet, the story never truly ended. It resurfaced in quiet ways, in conversations about missing persons cases that didn't get enough attention, in news articles that echoed familiar patterns, in the casual way people said, they probably just left, without considering the weight of that assumption. Each time, the family felt the same internal shift, the same tightening. They had learned what assumptions can cost. The final truth was this: discovery does not restore what was lost. It does not rewind time or soften regret. It does not correct a year spent searching in the wrong direction. But it does leave behind a responsibility to notice, to question, to resist the comfort of easy explanations. Because somewhere in some city, someone is not coming back, and the reason may be closer than anyone thinks. Christmas will still come. Lights will still glow. Cities will still rebuild. People will still disappear quietly, without spectacle. The difference lies in what we do with the silence they leave behind. Whether we allow it to be absorbed, paved over, forgotten, or whether we pause long enough to listen, to remember that absence is not emptiness, and that stories like this do not end when answers are found. They end only when no one is willing to carry them forward. And for this family, for as long as they speak the names, tell the stories, and refuse to let the truth dissolve into background noise, the disappearance will remain what it always was. Not just a mystery, but a warning.